The thunder cracked overhead as Abigail Blackett stared at the numbers in her ledger, the same impossible figures that had haunted her for months. Her father's general store now, her burden alone was drowning in debt, and the bank's deadline loomed just 1 week away. Pushing back a strand of auburn hair that had escaped her practical bun, she closed the book with trembling hands. She was 24 years old, unmarried, and about to lose everything her family had built in Wallace, Arizona Territory, 1878. The bell above the door jangled, and Abigail hastily wiped the moisture from her eyes before looking up. A tall stranger ducked through the doorway, his broad shoulders nearly filling the frame. Trail dust covered his denim pants and cotton shirt, and a well-worn Stetson shadowed eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Afternoon, madam," he said, his voice a low rumble that matched his weathered appearance. "I'm in need of supplies." Abigail smoothed her apron and moved to the counter. "Of course, what can I help you with, sir?" "Coffee, beans, hardtack, ammunition for a Winchester." He glanced around the store, noting the half-empty shelves, "and whatever fresh food you might have." As Abigail gathered the items, she felt his gaze following her movements. Not in the predatory way she'd grown accustomed to from some men since her father's passing, but with a quiet assessment that somehow made her stand straighter. Passing through. She asked, wrapping the coffee beans in brown paper. "For now," he replied. "Name's Dawson Pike, looking for work before moving on." "Not much to be had in Wallace these days," she said, unable to keep the weariness from her voice. "The silver mine's been tapped out for 2 years now, and half the town's moved on." Dawson nodded, as if confirming something he'd already surmised. "And your store seems quiet." Abigail's hands stilled on the counter. "It was my father's. He passed last winter, pneumonia." "My condolences," he said, and the simple sincerity in his voice nearly undid her carefully maintained composure. She quickly tallied his purchases. "That'll be $2.43, Mr. Pike." He placed $3 on the counter. "Keep the change, Miss Blackett." "Abigail Blackett, Miss Blackett." He tipped his hat, collected his supplies, and was gone. Abigail thought that would be the end of it, just another drifter passing through the dying town. But Dawson Pike appeared at her door the next morning as she was sweeping the boardwalk in front of the store. "I hear you might be in some trouble with the bank," he said without preamble. Abigail nearly dropped her broom. "Who told you that?" Bartender at the saloon. News travels fast in small towns. His expression remained impassive, but something in his eyes softened. "How bad is it?" "That's hardly your concern, Mr. Pike." Pride made her voice sharper than she'd intended. "Maybe not," he agreed, "but I've got a proposition if you're willing to hear it." Against her better judgment, Abigail gestured toward 2 chairs on the porch. Once seated, she folded her hands in her lap to hide their trembling. "I'm listening." Dawson leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I've been on the trail a long time, Miss Blackett. 10 years of driving cattle, hunting bounties, and doing odd jobs. I've saved near every penny." "I'm not looking for charity, Mr. Pike." "No charity," he said firmly. "An arrangement. I've been thinking of settling somewhere, getting tired of sleeping under the stars every night." Abigail frowned, uncertain where this was heading. "How much do you owe the bank?" he asked. She hesitated, then answered truthfully. $812. My father borrowed against the store to expand last year, just before the mine closed. "The bank's calling in the loan next Friday." Dawson nodded, seemingly unsurprised. "And what happens if you can't pay?" "I lose the store, my home." She looked away toward the distant mountains. "Everything." "What if I paid the debt?" Her head snapped back to face him. "Why would you do that?" "In exchange for my name." The words hung in the air between them. Abigail stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "Your name, marriage," he clarified, his expression serious. "I pay your debts, you become Mrs. Pike, the store becomes our business, I get a home, a purpose. You keep what's rightfully yours." Abigail stood abruptly. "Mr. Pike, we've barely exchanged a dozen sentences. You know nothing about me. I know you're proud but desperate. I know you run this place alone, which means you're capable. I know you're honest. You could have charged me more yesterday, and I wouldn't have known the difference. That's hardly enough to base a marriage on." She crossed her arms, though the proposal had sent her mind racing. What choice did she really have? It's more than many marriages start with, he countered. Look, I'm not asking for, that is, this would be a business arrangement, at least at first. Abigail's cheeks flushed. I should be outraged at your suggestion. But you're not, he observed quietly, because you know it makes sense. I'd need time to consider. The bank gives you a week, I'll give you 3 days. He stood, towering over her. I'm staying at the boarding house, let me know your decision. As he walked away, Abigail called after him. Why me, Mr. Pike? Why not any other woman in any other town? He paused, looking back over his shoulder. I've been to a lot of towns, Miss Blackett. Never met anyone who looked at ledger numbers with as much determination as you did yesterday. That's something worth investing in. For 3 days, Abigail barely slept. She paced the small apartment above the store, weighing her options. She could write to her mother's sister in Boston, but Aunt Alina had made it clear years ago that she disapproved of her sister's choice to follow her husband to the frontier. Pride kept Abigail from reaching out. She could try to secure another loan, but who would lend to a single woman with a failing business? She could sell what little inventory remained and use the money to buy a ticket east, seek employment as a teacher or companion. The thought made her stomach clench. This store, this town, was her home. On the morning of the 3rd day, Abigail found herself walking toward the boarding house, her decision made. She didn't love Dawson Pike, she didn't even know him, but she respected his directness and the fairness of his proposal. A marriage of convenience was hardly romantic, but it was practical. And if there was one thing Abigail Blackett prided herself on, it was practicality. Dawson was sitting on the boarding house porch, whittling a piece of wood. He looked up as she approached, his knife stilling. I accept your proposal, Abigail said without preamble, on 3 conditions. A hint of a smile touched his lips. Name them. First, the store remains in both our names. Second, I maintain control of the ledgers and accounts. Third, she hesitated, steeling herself. Third, we present this as a proper marriage to the town. No one needs to know the true nature of our arrangement. Dawson considered her terms, then nodded. I have conditions of my own. Abigail tensed. Yes, you give this a real chance, not just the business, but us. I'm not asking for love, Miss Blackett, but I am asking for the possibility of it. His frankness caught her off guard. I can agree to that. And one more thing. He stood, pocketing his knife and the half-carved figurine. I want honesty between us always, even when it's difficult. Honesty, she echoed. Yes, that's fair. Then we have an agreement. He extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she placed her smaller one in his calloused palm. They were married 2 days later by the town's circuit riding preacher who happened to be passing through. The ceremony was brief, held in the small church with only the preacher's wife and the town's mayor as witnesses. Abigail wore her best dress, a navy blue affair that had belonged to her mother, and Dawson wore a clean shirt and a newly purchased waistcoat. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Dawson leaned down and placed a gentle kiss on Abigail's lips. It was brief, but it sent an unexpected warmth through her that lingered long after they'd signed the marriage certificate. The following day, they walked to the bank together. Inside, Abigail introduced Dawson as her husband to Mr. Fleming, the bank manager, whose eyes widened in surprise. I wasn't aware you had married, Mrs. Pike, he said, looking between them with undisguised curiosity. It was a quiet affair, Abigail replied, her voice steadier than she felt. My husband has come to settle the loan. Dawson placed a leather pouch on the banker's desk. $812, as I understand it. Fleming looked like he'd swallowed something sour as he counted out the money. When he finished, he reluctantly handed Abigail the deed to the store, free of the bank's claim. Everything appears to be in order. Congratulations on your timely marriage, Mrs. Pike. Outside, Abigail clutched the deed to her chest, relief washing over her. Thank you, she said quietly to Dawson. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. You don't need to, he replied. That's what partners do, they help each other. Partners, she repeated, the words sounding strange and right at the same time. Yes, I suppose we are. That evening, they sat in the small kitchen above the store, sharing a meal Abigail had prepared. The awkwardness between them was palpable as they navigated their new reality. "I've set up a bed for you in the spare room," Abigail said, not meeting his eyes. "It's small, but it'll be fine," Dawson assured her. "I've slept on the ground more nights than I can count. A real bed of any size is luxury." After dinner, they worked together to clear the table. Their hands brushed as they both reached for the same plate, and Abigail pulled back as if burned. Dawson's expression remained unreadable, but he stepped back, giving her space. "I thought we might discuss the store tomorrow," he said. "I have some ideas that might help increase business." Abigail looked at him with surprise. "You know about running a store?" "Not specifically," he admitted. "But I know about supply routes, fair pricing, and what items travelers need. I've been on both sides of enough counters to have some notions." "I'd welcome the help," she said, and meant it. The weight of running the store alone had been crushing her for months. "Perhaps after breakfast." "After breakfast," he agreed, and bid her good night. As Abigail lay in bed that night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person moving in the room down the hall, she wondered what she had gotten herself into. Dawson Pike was still largely a mystery to her, a man who had appeared out of nowhere with enough money to save her, asking only for a shared life in return. She didn't know if she could ever love him, but she was determined to honor their agreement. She would give this marriage, this partnership, a real chance. The days that followed established a routine. They rose early, took breakfast together, and opened the store. Dawson proved surprisingly adept at dealing with customers, his quiet confidence putting even the most taciturn ranchers at ease. Meanwhile, Abigail handled the accounts and ordering, implementing some of Dawson's suggestions about inventory. A week into their marriage, Dawson approached her with a proposal. "I think we should order more ammunition and hunting supplies," he said. "The silver mine may be closed, but there's still good trapping in the hills, and the ranch hands always need cartridges." "We've never stocked much of that," Abigail replied doubtfully. "Father always focused on household goods." "Exactly," Dawson said. "Which means men go to Jefferson for their supplies, and while they're there, their wives buy household items too. If we can bring the men here for ammunition, we might keep more of the women's business as well." Abigail considered his logic, then nodded slowly. "It's worth trying." "I'll adjust our next order." The change proved successful. Within a month, their daily receipts had nearly doubled. Men who had previously ridden the extra 15 miles to Jefferson now stopped at Blackett's general store, which Abigail had insisted on keeping the name of, despite her own change in surname. And Dawson had been right where the men came, their families followed. As the store's prospects improved, so did the awkward tension between them. They learned each other's rhythms, anticipating needs in the store without having to speak. Abigail discovered that Dawson was a man of few words but careful observation. He seemed to notice everything: the way she took her coffee, with just a touch of molasses, which customers tried to haggle unfairly, how she rubbed her lower back after a long day of standing. One evening, after a particularly busy day, Abigail was preparing dinner when Dawson entered the kitchen with something behind his back. "I have something for you," he said, looking uncharacteristically hesitant. "For me?" Abigail wiped her hands on her apron. "What is it?" He held out a small wooden figure, a delicately carved fox, its clever face and bushy tail rendered with remarkable detail. "You made this?" she asked, turning it over in her hands. "Been working on it in the evenings," he said, looking pleased at her evident admiration. "Reminded me of you." "A fox reminds you of me?" She wasn't sure if she should be flattered or offended. "Smart," he explained. "Resourceful, determined." His lips curved in a rare smile. "And that red gold hair of yours." Abigail felt a blush spreading across her cheeks. It was perhaps the most personal thing he'd ever said to her. "Thank you, it's beautiful craftsmanship." "My father taught me," Dawson said, sitting at the table. "He was a carpenter before he caught gold fever and dragged us to California in '49. Did he find his fortune?" Abigail asked, setting aside the carving to continue with dinner preparations. "No," Dawson replied, his voice matter of fact rather than bitter. Died of typhoid fever in a mining camp when I was 12. My mother followed 6 months later. Abigail's hands stilled. I'm sorry. That must have been terribly difficult, he shrugged, though the movement seemed to carry the weight of old grief. It was a long time ago. I made my way with odd jobs, ranch work, eventually cattle drives. He paused. What about your mother? You've spoken of your father, but… She died when I was 16, Abigail said softly. Her heart, the doctor said, father never really recovered from losing her. That's when I started helping more with the store. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, connected by the shared experience of loss. It was the first truly personal conversation they'd had, and Abigail found herself wanting to know more about the man she'd married. Why did you really help me, Dawson? She asked suddenly. The truth, please. He considered her question, his gray eyes thoughtful. I told you part of the truth that day. I was tired of drifting, but he seemed to be choosing his words carefully. I recognized something in you, a kind of solitude that matched my own. The simple honesty of his answer caught Abigail by surprise. I think I understand, she said quietly. Thank you for your honesty. That night, for the first time, Dawson reached for her hand as they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains. His touch was tentative, giving her every opportunity to pull away. Instead, Abigail let her fingers twine with his, marveling at how natural it felt. As summer turned to fall, the store continued to prosper under their joint management. Word spread through the territory about the fair prices and expanding inventory at Blackett's general store, bringing customers from as far as 20 miles away. They added a line of tack and horse equipment at Dawson's suggestion, which proved especially popular with the cowboys from surrounding ranches. With the increased business came increased scrutiny of their unusual marriage. Wallace was a small town, and people noticed that the Pikes, while unfailingly polite to each other, lacked the easy affection of most newlyweds. Gossip began to circulate that theirs was a marriage of convenience which, while not unheard of on the frontier, still invited speculation. Abigail became aware of the whispers when Mrs. Hollis, the minister's wife, visited the store one afternoon while Dawson was out. Such a blessing that Mr. Pike came along when he did, Mrs. Hollis said, examining a bolt of calico with more attention than it warranted. After your father's passing and the trouble with the bank, well, some might call it providential timing. The implication was clear in her tone. Abigail felt her cheeks warm but kept her expression neutral. Yes, I consider myself very fortunate to have met Dawson when I did. Of course, marriage is about more than practical concerns, Mrs. Hollis continued. It requires true affection to weather life's storms. Indeed it does, Abigail agreed, her smile tight. Will that be all today, Mrs. Hollis? That evening, Abigail told Dawson about the encounter. People are talking, she said, pacing the small sitting room. They suspect our arrangement isn't conventional. Dawson watched her from his chair, his expression unreadable. Does that bother you? Doesn't it bother you? She countered. Your reputation, my reputation, has survived worse than small-town gossip, he said calmly. The question is whether it bothers you. Abigail stopped pacing. I don't like being the subject of speculation, and I don't like people doubting the validity of our marriage. Then we'll have to give them less to speculate about, Dawson said, standing. He crossed the room to where she stood, his movements deliberate. May I? She nodded, not entirely sure what she was agreeing to. Dawson gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. The simple touch sent warmth cascading through her. We could practice, he suggested, his voice low. Being more married in public. Practice? Abigail echoed, distracted by his proximity. Small gestures, the kind married couples share without thinking. His hand moved to rest lightly at the small of her back. Like this, or holding hands as we've done. Yes, she agreed, her voice hardly more than a whisper. That seems reasonable. The next day, as they worked in the store together, Dawson made a point of standing closer to her than usual. When customers entered, his hand would find her waist or shoulder in a casual, possessive gesture. At first, Abigail found herself tensing at each touch, but as the day wore on, she began to relax into them, even to anticipate them. During a lull in business, Dawson leaned close to whisper in her ear. "Mrs. Holly's is across the street, watching. She's been there for 5 minutes." Abigail glanced out the window and saw the minister's wife pretending to examine the bulletin board outside the post office. "What do you suggest?" she asked. In response, Dawson turned her gently to face him. "May I kiss you, Abigail?" Her breath caught at the question, but she nodded. Dawson lowered his head slowly, giving her every chance to change her mind. When his lips met hers, the kiss was soft, almost reverent. Unlike the brief peck at their wedding, this lingered, warming as Abigail's hands came up to rest against his chest. When they parted, she saw that his eyes had darkened to the color of storm clouds. "That should give Mrs. Holly something to talk about," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Yes," Abigail agreed, trying to steady her racing heart. "I believe it will." That evening, as they prepared for bed, the air between them felt charged with unspoken tension. Abigail paused at her bedroom door. "Dawson," he turned halfway to his own room. "Yes, thank you for today." She twisted her hands in her skirt, for understanding. He nodded, his expression softening. "Good night, Abigail." "Good night," she replied, disappearing into her room before she could say something impulsive. As October arrived, bringing cooler temperatures to the Arizona territory, Abigail found herself thinking about the approaching holidays. It would be her first Christmas without her father, but also her first as a married woman. The thought brought a confusing mix of grief and anticipation. One morning, as they were preparing the store for opening, Dawson mentioned that he needed to make a trip to Jefferson. "What for?" Abigail asked, surprised. They ordered most of their supplies through catalogs or the traveling salesman who passed through Wallace. "Some personal business," he replied. "I shouldn't be gone more than 2 days." "Oh." Abigail tried to hide her disappointment. They hadn't been apart since their wedding, and she was surprised by how much she would miss his presence. "Of course, the store will be fine." Dawson left the following morning on the stagecoach. The hours dragged without him, the store seeming unusually quiet despite a steady stream of customers. Abigail found herself looking up whenever the door opened, expecting to see his tall figure. That night, alone in the apartment, she wandered into Dawson's room, curious about the space he occupied. It was spare, with few personal possessions beyond his saddle bags, a rifle mounted on the wall, and a small stack of books on the nightstand. She picked one up, a well-worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets, and was surprised to find the margins filled with neat annotations in Dawson's handwriting. Abigail sat on the edge of his bed, flipping through the pages with growing wonder. This glimpse into his inner thoughts revealed a thoughtfulness she had suspected, but never fully appreciated. She returned the book carefully to its place, feeling as though she had seen something intimate and precious. Dawson returned late on the second day, arriving after she had closed the store. When she heard his footsteps on the stairs, Abigail rushed to the door with an eagerness that would have embarrassed her if she'd stopped to consider it. "You're back," she said, unable to keep the pleasure from her voice. "As promised," he replied, his eyes warming at her welcome. He carried a large package wrapped in brown paper. "I brought something for the store." "What is it?" she asked, curious. He unwrapped the package to reveal a beautiful brass cash register with ornate decorations on its sides. "The latest model," he explained. "It'll calculate faster than doing sums on paper, and it looks impressive to customers." Abigail ran her fingers over the gleaming machine. "It must have been expensive. An investment in our future," Dawson said simply. "And there's something else." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small package. "For you, not the store." Inside was a delicate silver brooch in the shape of a fox. The detail was exquisite, from the pointed ears to the bushy tail curled around its body. "It's beautiful," Abigail whispered, deeply touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "I had it made in Jefferson," Dawson explained. "Thought it might remind you of our first real conversation." Impulsively, Abigail rose on tiptoes and kissed his cheek. "Thank you, I'll treasure it." That night, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Abigail found herself studying her husband's profile. The firelight cast his features in sharp relief, the strong line of his jaw, the slight crook in his nose that spoke of an old break, the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck. She realized with a start that she found him handsome, not in the conventional way of the men in illustrations from Eastern magazines, but in a rugged, lived-in way that spoke of resilience and character. "What are you thinking?" Dawson asked, catching her gaze. "That I know so little about you still," she answered honestly. "Where you've been, what you've done, the kind of man you are." He turned to face her fully. "What would you like to know?" "Everything," she said simply, "but we could start with how you came to have enough money to pay off my debts." "Few cowboys I've known save that kind of sum." Dawson was quiet for a long moment, and Abigail worried she had crossed some invisible boundary. Finally, he spoke. "I worked as a bounty hunter for a few years, dangerous work, but it paid well. Then I got tired of tracking men to their deaths and took what I'd saved to buy cattle. Drove them north to Montana where prices were higher, sold them for a good profit." He paused. "That's where the money came from, nothing illegal if that's what you're worried about." "I wasn't," Abigail assured him. "Just curious." She hesitated, then asked, "Have you killed many men?" "Some," he admitted, his expression guarded. "Only those who needed killing: murderers, rapists, men who'd prey on the weak. I never took pleasure in it." Abigail reached for his hand, seeing the shadow of old regrets in his eyes. "I believe you." His fingers tightened around hers. "Any other questions?" "Not tonight," she said softly, "but I'd like to hear more stories when you're ready to share them." As November brought the first frost to Wallace, their relationship continued to evolve. The practiced displays of affection became more natural, less calculated. Abigail found herself reaching for Dawson's hand without thinking, leaning into his touch when he placed his arm around her waist. What had begun as a performance for the town's benefit was becoming genuine comfort and connection. One evening, they attended a harvest dance at the town hall. It was the first social event they'd attended as a couple, and Abigail felt a flutter of nerves as they entered the crowded room. She wore her best dress, a burgundy wool with lace at the collar and the fox brooch pinned at her throat. Dawson had donned a new shirt and waistcoat for the occasion, his usually windswept hair neatly combed. Mrs. Hollis spotted them immediately, bustling over with her husband in tow. "Mr. and Mrs. Pike, how lovely to see you both. And might I say, marriage certainly agrees with you, Abigail. There's a glow about you I don't recall seeing before." Abigail felt Dawson's arm tighten slightly around her waist. "Thank you, Mrs. Hollis. I'm very happy." "As you should be," the older woman said with a meaningful smile. "Now, Reverend Hollis was just saying how impressed he is with the improvements to the store. Weren't you, dear?" As the minister launched into a discussion about the expanded inventory, Abigail felt Dawson's breath against her ear. "Would you like to dance?" he murmured. She nodded, and he politely excused them from the conversation. The band was playing a waltz, and Dawson led her confidently onto the dance floor. "I didn't know you could dance," Abigail said as they moved in perfect time to the music. "Learned in San Francisco," he replied. "Thought it might be a useful skill someday for impressing ladies," she teased, surprised at her own boldness, his eyes crinkled at the corners. "Is it working?" "Perhaps," she admitted, feeling lighthearted in a way she hadn't in years. They danced 3 more times before taking a break for refreshments. Several of the town's residents stopped to chat, and Abigail noticed that people were treating them differently, not with the veiled suspicion of a hasty, convenient marriage, but with the warmth extended to any well-matched couple. As they walked home under a canopy of stars, Dawson kept his arm around her shoulders to ward off the chill. "You're good with people," he observed. "They trust you." "It helps that most of them have known me all my life," Abigail replied. "You're the mystery they're trying to solve." "And have you?" he asked, glancing down at her. "Solved the mystery of Dawson Pike. I'm still working on it," she admitted, "but I think I'm beginning to understand the important parts." When they reached the store, Dawson paused on the porch, looking out at the silent street. "I've been thinking about expanding," he said. "Not just the inventory, but the building itself. We could add a storeroom in the back, maybe even a proper office for you to do the books." "That sounds wonderful," Abigail said, touched by his use of "we" and the long-term planning it implied. But it would be expensive. We've been doing well, he pointed out, and I have some savings left. It would be a good investment. They continued discussing the idea as they prepared for bed, their conversation flowing easily as they moved around each other in the small apartment. When they reached their respective bedroom doors, Abigail found herself reluctant to say goodnight. "Dawson," she said, gathering her courage, "I've been thinking about our arrangement." His expression became carefully neutral. "Yes, when we married, you said you wanted a real chance. Not just for the business, but for us." She took a deep breath. I think I'm ready to give us that chance more fully." Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by a warmth that made her heart race. "Are you certain, Abigail? There's no rush." "I'm certain," she said, and was surprised to find it was true. Somewhere in the past months, between shared meals and quiet evenings, between the touch of his hand and the sight of his smile, she had begun to care for Dawson Pike in a way that went far beyond their practical arrangement. He stepped toward her, his movements unhurried. When he reached her, he cradled her face in his hands with such gentleness that tears pricked at her eyes. "I've been falling in love with you since the day I walked into your store," he confessed, his voice rough with emotion. "But I promised myself I'd wait until you were ready." "I'm ready," Abigail whispered, rising to meet his kiss. That night they truly became husband and wife. Dawson's tenderness brought tears to Abigail's eyes, his patience and care revealing yet another facet of the man she was coming to love. In the quiet aftermath, as they lay tangled in each other's arms, Abigail felt a sense of rightness, as if all the scattered pieces of her life had finally found their proper places. "I love you," she said softly against his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady and strong beneath her cheek. His arms tightened around her. "And I love you, Abigail Pike." The following morning, Abigail woke to find Dawson already dressed and sitting on the edge of the bed, watching her with a tender expression. "Good morning, wife," he said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She smiled, stretching lazily. "Good morning, husband. I have something to tell you," he said, his expression growing serious. "Something I should have shared before now." Abigail sat up, pulling the sheet around her. "What is it? Before I came to Wallace, I was tracking someone." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "A man named Carver who robbed a bank in Prescott. 3 people died in the robbery, including a child." "You said you'd stopped bounty hunting," Abigail said slowly. "I had," Dawson confirmed, "but this was personal. The child who died was my friend's daughter. I promised him I'd bring Carver to justice." "And did you find him?" "I tracked him as far as Jefferson. Lost the trail there." Dawson's jaw tightened. "When I went there last month, I heard rumors that he might have moved on to New Mexico territory." Abigail absorbed this information, understanding its implications. "Are you planning to go after him?" "No," Dawson said firmly. "That part of my life is over. I've sent word to the territorial marshal with everything I know. It's in his hands now." Relief flooded through Abigail. "Why tell me this now?" "Because I don't want secrets between us," he said simply. "Not anymore. You deserve the whole truth about the man you've married." She reached for his hand, twining her fingers with his. "Thank you for telling me, for trusting me." He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm. "Always." As Christmas approached, Wallace experienced an unexpected boom. A new copper vein had been discovered in the old silver mine, bringing an influx of miners and the businesses that catered to them. The general store thrived, with Dawson's expansion plans becoming more urgent as they struggled to keep enough stock on hand to meet demand. Construction began on the addition in early December, with Dawson overseeing the work. His knowledge of carpentry proved invaluable as he worked alongside the hired men, saving them considerable expense. Abigail watched with pride as the building took shape, the new storeroom and office representing not just business success, but the solid foundation of their shared future. One afternoon, as Abigail was sorting through a shipment of Christmas goods, the door opened to admit a travel-worn man in an expensive but dusty suit. Something about his shifty gaze put her immediately on edge. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, setting aside the box of ornaments. "Just passing through," the man replied, his eyes scanning the store. Need some supplies, tobacco, ammunition for a Colt, maybe some decent whiskey if you have it. We don't carry spirits, Abigail informed him, but I can help with the other items. As she gathered his purchases, she noticed him watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. When she returned to the counter, he leaned forward, too close for propriety. You run this place alone, madam? No, she said firmly. My husband and I run it together. He's just out back overseeing construction. The man's eyes narrowed slightly. Husband, huh, lucky man. Before Abigail could respond, the back door opened and Dawson entered, wiping his hands on a rag. He stopped abruptly when he saw the customer, his body tensing in a way Abigail had never seen before. Carver, he said, his voice deadly quiet. The man's hand moved toward his coat, but Dawson was faster. In one fluid motion, he drew the pistol he'd taken to wearing during construction and leveled it at the man's chest. Don't, Dawson warned. Abigail, step away from the counter, now. She did as instructed, her heart pounding in her ears. Dawson, what? This is the man I told you about, he said, not taking his eyes off Carver. The bank robber from Prescott. Carver's face twisted into an ugly smile. Well, if it isn't Dawson Pike, still playing lawman, I see. Thought you'd given up the hunt. I did, Dawson replied evenly. You just happened to walk into my store. Your store, Carver laughed, a harsh sound. So the rumors are true. The great bounty hunter has settled down to play shopkeeper with a pretty wife. His gaze slid to Abigail, making her skin crawl. Very pretty indeed. Keep your eyes off my wife, Dawson growled. Abigail, go get Sheriff Barnes. Before she could move, Carver lunged across the counter, grabbing for Dawson's gun. The two men struggled, their movements knocking over displays and sending merchandise crashing to the floor. Abigail grabbed the shotgun they kept under the counter, but couldn't get a clear shot without risking hitting Dawson. The gun went off with a deafening crack and both men froze. For a horrible moment, Abigail couldn't tell who had been hit. Then Carver staggered backward, clutching his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. You son of a bitch, he snarled, reaching for his own weapon with his good hand. Dawson fired again, and Carver collapsed, his gun clattering unfired to the floor. Dawson. Abigail rushed forward as her husband sagged against the counter, his face ashen. I'm all right, he assured her, though his voice was strained. Check if he's alive. With trembling hands, Abigail knelt beside Carver. The man's eyes stared sightlessly at the ceiling, a dark stain spreading across his chest. He's dead, she said quietly. By the time Sheriff Barnes arrived, drawn by the sound of gunshots, a small crowd had gathered outside the store. Dawson explained what had happened, his arm around Abigail's shoulders as she struggled to stop shaking. Carver had a $500 bounty on his head, the sheriff informed them after examining the body. Dead or alive, that money's rightfully yours, Pike. Dawson shook his head. I don't want it. Give it to the families of the people he killed in Prescott. After the sheriff and undertaker had removed the body and the crowd had dispersed, Abigail and Dawson surveyed the damage to their store. Broken glass and scattered merchandise littered the floor, and a bullet hole marred the new cash register. I'm sorry, Dawson said, looking around at the destruction. I never wanted to bring violence into our home. Abigail took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. Listen to me, Dawson Pike. You didn't bring this here. He did. And you protected us, protected me, just as I know you always will. Relief washed over his features, and he pulled her into a tight embrace. I couldn't bear it if anything happened to you, he murmured into her hair. You've become my whole world, Abigail. They spent the rest of the day cleaning up the mess and rearranging the store. Word of the incident spread quickly through Wallace, and by the next morning, it seemed everyone in town had found a reason to visit the general store. Business had never been better, though Abigail suspected it had less to do with genuine need for supplies and more with curiosity about the drama that had unfolded. That evening, after closing the store, Dawson built a fire in their small hearth while Abigail prepared a simple supper. As they sat down to eat, he reached across the table to take her hand. I've been thinking, he said, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. Maybe we should consider moving the living quarters once the expansion is complete, build a proper house behind the store. A house. Abigail repeated, surprised by the suggestion. Something with more room, he explained, a hint of nervousness in his voice. In case our family grows someday. Abigail's breath caught. They hadn't discussed children, though the possibility had been in her thoughts more frequently of late. Are you saying you want children? With you? Yes, Dawson said simply. If you want them too, I do, she admitted, her heart full. Very much. His smile was like sunrise breaking across the mountains. Then we'll build a house with room for children. As Christmas Day arrived, Wallace was blanketed in a rare snowfall that transformed the dusty streets into a winter wonderland. Abigail woke to the smell of coffee and found Dawson already up, stoking the fire. "Merry Christmas, wife," he said, handing her a steaming cup. "Merry Christmas, husband." She accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. They had agreed to exchange gifts before attending the community Christmas service at the church. Dawson's gift to Abigail was a beautiful leather-bound journal with her initials stamped in gold on the cover. "For keeping the store accounts," he explained, "or for writing down your thoughts, whatever you wish." "It's perfect," she said sincerely, running her fingers over the supple leather. "Now yours." Abigail's gift to Dawson was a finely crafted pocket watch with a fox engraved on the case, a companion piece to the brooch he had given her. Inside, she had inscribed, "To DP, who gave me his name and found my heart, AP." Dawson stared at the inscription for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he looked up, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "This is the finest gift I've ever received," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "There's something else," Abigail said, suddenly nervous. "Something I couldn't wrap." "Oh," Dawson looked at her curiously. I think I might be with child," she said softly. "It's too early to be certain, but I've missed my monthly course and I've been feeling different these past weeks." Dawson was perfectly still for a heartbeat, then he let out a whoop of joy that startled a laugh from Abigail. In the next moment, he had swept her into his arms, spinning her around the small room. "Careful," she gasped through her laughter. "If I am with child, you'll make us both dizzy." He set her down gently, his hands lingering protectively at her waist. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "Our baby." "Possibly," she cautioned. "We won't know for certain for a while yet." "I'm already certain," Dawson declared, his face alight with happiness. "I can feel it." "We're going to be parents, Abigail." As they walked to church that morning, the snow crunching beneath their boots, Abigail reflected on the extraordinary year that was ending. 12 months ago, she had been alone, drowning in debt, facing the loss of everything she held dear. Now she walked arm in arm with a husband she loved deeply, carrying the possibility of new life within her, their business thriving beyond her most optimistic hopes. When they reached the church, Mrs. Hollis greeted them warmly. "My dears, you both look positively radiant this morning. The blessings of the season must agree with you." Dawson's arm tightened around Abigail's waist. "We have much to be thankful for," he agreed, exchanging a private smile with his wife. During the service, as the congregation sang carols and Reverend Hollis spoke of hope and new beginnings, Dawson held Abigail's hand, his thumb occasionally brushing over her wedding ring. When the Reverend invited them to pray, Abigail closed her eyes, her heart overflowing with gratitude for the unexpected gift that had walked into her store one dusty afternoon, a traveling cowboy who had offered his name and found so much more. By spring, there was no doubt about Abigail's condition. Her dresses needed letting out, and a gentle roundness had appeared beneath her apron. Dawson was endearingly protective, insisting she rest frequently and hiring a young woman named Emily to help in the store. Abigail protested that she wasn't an invalid, but secretly appreciated his concern. The expansion of the store was completed in March, the new storeroom and office proving invaluable as business continued to grow. They began construction on their house in April, a modest but comfortable home with 4 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides. Dawson insisted on doing much of the finish work himself. carving decorative elements for the stair railings and crafting built-in shelves for Abigail's books. As Abigail's time grew near, they hired a manager for the store, a retired merchant named Harrison who had moved to Wallace for his health. This allowed them to focus on preparing for the baby's arrival and settling into their new home. On a warm July evening, as Dawson and Abigail sat on their porch watching the sunset, she felt the first contraction. 12 hours later, with the assistance of the town's midwife, she gave birth to a healthy son whom they named Daniel James Pike, after both their fathers. Dawson's face when he first held his son was something Abigail knew she would remember until her dying day, a mixture of awe, terror, and the purest love she had ever witnessed. "He's perfect," Dawson whispered, one finger gently tracing the baby's tiny features. "Just like his mother." Life settled into a new rhythm with Daniel at its center. Dawson proved to be a devoted father, as comfortable rocking a fussy baby in the middle of the night as he was negotiating with suppliers or handling difficult customers. Abigail recovered quickly from the birth and soon found a balance between motherhood and her work at the store, which she refused to abandon entirely despite Dawson's assurances that they could manage without her income. "The store isn't just about money," she explained one evening as they sat in the nursery watching Daniel sleep. "It's part of who I am, part of what brought us together." Dawson nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Then we'll make it work," he promised, "together as always." By Daniel's first birthday, the general store had become the center of commerce in Wallace. They had expanded their inventory to include farm equipment, furniture, and even a small selection of books, the latter at Abigail's insistence. The copper mine continued to produce, ensuring the town's prosperity for the foreseeable future. On the anniversary of the day Dawson had walked into the store, they closed early and took Daniel for a picnic by the creek that ran behind their property. As the boy toddled around, exploring every rock and stick with solemn concentration, Dawson pulled Abigail close. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Agreeing to my proposition?" "Never," she said firmly. "It was the best decision I ever made." Even though it started as a business arrangement, Abigail smiled, remembering the awkward, uncertain first days of their marriage. "Especially because of that, we built something real together, Dawson, something lasting." He nodded, his eyes on their son. "I rode into Wallace with nothing but money and a vague notion of settling down," he said reflectively. "I never imagined finding a family, a home. And I never imagined loving a man who offered to marry me to pay my debts," Abigail teased gently. "Life has a way of surprising us." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the grass, Daniel abandoned his explorations and toddled back to his parents, his face split by a wide grin that revealed 4 tiny teeth. "Mama, Papa," he declared, falling into Dawson's outstretched arms. Dawson scooped him up, tickling his round belly and eliciting delighted squeals. "This boy is getting heavy," he observed, "growing like a weed." "He'll be as tall as you someday," Abigail predicted, smoothing Daniel's unruly hair so like his father's in color and texture. "God help us if he's as stubborn as his mother," Dawson replied with a wink. As they packed up their picnic and headed home, Daniel dozing against his father's shoulder, Abigail reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought them to this moment. What had begun as desperation, a debt she couldn't pay, a future she couldn't secure alone, had blossomed into something precious beyond measure. In offering his name, Dawson Pike had given her far more than financial security. He had given her partnership, passion, and a love that grew stronger with each passing day. And Abigail, in accepting that offer, had given him something equally valuable: a home to return to, a purpose beyond wandering, and a family to call his own. What had started as a practical arrangement had transformed into the truest partnership either of them could have imagined. As they reached their home, the house Dawson had built with his own hands, filled now with the evidence of their shared life, Abigail felt a profound sense of gratitude. For the man who had appeared when she needed him most, for the son who had brought new joy into their lives, and for the journey that had only just begun. Dawson caught her gaze over their sleeping child's head, his eyes reflecting the same contentment she felt in her heart. No words were needed, the understanding between them was complete. Whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them together not as a woman who could not pay her debts and the traveling cowboy who had offered his name, but as true partners in every sense of the word. 10 years later, the town of Wallace had grown into a prosperous community, with Blackett's general store still at its heart. The store had expanded twice more and now occupied half the block, selling everything from farm equipment to fine china imported from the East. Dawson and Abigail had added 2 more children to their family, a daughter, Elizabeth, now 7, and another son, Thomas, who had just turned 4. On a crisp autumn morning, as Abigail stood on the porch of their home watching Daniel ride off to school on the pony Dawson had given him for his 9th birthday, she felt her husband's arms encircle her from behind. "Penny, for your thoughts," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "I was just thinking about how much has changed," she said, leaning back against his solid chest. "Remember when we worried about losing the store?" Dawson chuckled, the sound rumbling through her. "Seems like another lifetime." "It does," she agreed, "though I wouldn't change a moment of it." Inside, they could hear Elizabeth practicing her piano lesson while Thomas chattered to his wooden toys, a collection of animals Dawson had carved for him. Their home was full of noise and life, so different from the quiet loneliness Abigail had known before Dawson's arrival. "I have something to show you," Dawson said, taking her hand. "In the study." He led her to the small room off the main parlor that served as their shared office, where they still kept the books for the store, though they now employed a full staff to handle daily operations. On the desk lay a document bearing the territorial seal. "What's this?" Abigail asked, picking it up. "Deed to the Wilcox property," Dawson explained, naming a large tract of land outside town that had recently come up for sale. "I thought we might consider building a new home there, something with more land for the children to roam, maybe raise some horses." Abigail studied the document, then looked up at her husband with surprise. "Are you thinking of going back to ranching?" "Not exactly," he said, taking a seat on the edge of the desk. "But I miss working with horses. Thought I might breed and train them on a small scale, something to occupy my hands now that Harrison runs most of the day-to-day at the store." It was true that their success had brought a certain amount of leisure, a mixed blessing for a man like Dawson, who had spent his life in constant motion and physical labor. Though he still oversaw the business and handled major decisions, Abigail had noticed him growing restless in recent months. "I think it's a wonderful idea," she said sincerely. "The children would love the space, and you've always had a way with horses." Relief crossed his features. "You wouldn't mind moving? I know how attached you are to this house." "The house is just walls and a roof," Abigail said, setting down the deed to take his hands in hers. "Home is wherever we are together." Dawson pulled her into his arms, still as strong and sure as they had been on that first day in the store. "Have I told you today how much I love you, Abigail Pike?" "You have," she replied with a smile. "But I never tire of hearing it." As they began planning their new home and venture, Abigail marveled at how their partnership continued to evolve. What had begun as a practical solution to her financial troubles had grown into a life richer than she could have imagined: a thriving business, a loving family, and a relationship that deepened with each passing year. She thought often of that desperate young woman who had stood on the porch of a failing store, weighing an offer of marriage from a stranger. How could she have known then that in accepting Dawson's name, she wasn't just solving a problem, she was embracing a future filled with love, growth, and endless possibility? On the day they moved into their new ranch home, a sprawling, comfortable house with views of the mountains from every window, Abigail stood with Dawson on the porch, watching their children explore the property with whoops of excitement. "Are you happy?" Dawson asked, his arm around her waist. Abigail looked up at the man who had ridden into her life when she needed him most, the man whose quiet strength, unwavering love, and steadfast partnership had changed her world. "Completely," she said, and knew it was the truest word she had ever spoken. In offering his name to a woman who could not pay her debts, Dawson Pike had found far more than a business partner. He had found his heart's home. And Abigail, in accepting that offer, had gained not just financial security, but a love story more beautiful than any she could have written for herself, one that continued to unfold with each new day, each new challenge, each new adventure they faced together. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long, golden shadows across their new land, Dawson and Abigail stood hand in hand, watching their children play in the last light of day. The journey that had begun with a desperate bargain had led them here, to this moment of perfect contentment, proof that sometimes the most unpromising beginnings can lead to the most beautiful endings. And as Dawson turned to her, his eyes still holding the same warmth they had shown on that first day in the store, Abigail knew with absolute certainty that their story was far from over. It would continue to grow and change, just as they did, a true partnership forged in necessity, strengthened by adversity, and sustained by the deepest love either of them had ever known.